Okay, I just gave you a few examples of geologic time. Basically, that means the age of the Earth. Now let's move back on to biological evolution. Where we just left off in the history of evolutionary thought is at a time when many scientists in the 1800s had accepted that changes in living organisms had occurred. So they had accepted that change had happened over time, but they had not reached a consensus on how or why these changes had occurred. So evolution had been discovered, so to speak, but the scientific community had not yet found the mechanism by which these changes in organisms, or evolution, had occurred. Charles Darwin was a naturalist who traveled on an expedition on the HMS Beagle beginning in 1831. The voyage lasted almost 5 years, taking Darwin across the coasts of South America to the Galapagos Islands, across the Pacific to Australia, and then across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans and back to England. On this journey, Darwin observed a tremendous diversity of living creatures as well as astounding fossils of extinct animals. And he noted that species varied according to their environments. So, in his book on the origin of species, published in 1859, 20 years after his voyage, he described a theory of evolution that accounted for change within species and the emergence of new species based on his observations. This theory is known as the theory of evolution by natural selection. And this is very important for you to know this week. The definition of natural selection is the evolutionary process through which factors in the environment exert pressure, favoring some individuals over others to produce the next generation. Charles Darwin stated that there are 4 conditions which must be met for natural selection to occur. These are known as Darwin's postulates. There must be variation or differences in individuals' traits. So individuals in a population will have different traits. These traits must be heritable, able to be passed on to the next generation. The fitness, or the ability to survive and reproduce in your population or in your environment, also varies among individuals. So this means that some survive and reproduce and some don't. Fitness, again, the ability to survive, not only to survive but to reproduce, depends on those variable traits. In which case, individuals with greater fitness will survive, reproduce, and pass on these traits more often than individuals with less fitness. Therefore, the next generation will have greater frequencies of the traits, which allow for greater fitness. So let's go through Darwin's postulates step by step. Here we can see that there's variation in individuals' traits in this population of beetles. There are green beetles and brown beetles. Well, in this slide, the brown ones are orange, which is fine. These traits must be heritable or able to be passed on to the next generation. So we're assuming that green beetles have more green beetles and orange beetles have more orange beetles. So fitness, the ability to survive and reproduce, is variable. So we're seeing that the green beetles are getting picked off and they're not passing on their genes as often as the orange beetles. So we saw 1, that there was variation, 2, that those traits were heritable, 3, that fitness varied, some survive and reproduce and some don't. And finally, we're seeing that factors in the environment of these beetles, in this case the factor is the birds, are selecting either for or against some of these traits. We're seeing that in this environment, the orange beetles have an advantage. Therefore, they are more likely to pass on their orange genes or their orange traits and pass those on to further generations. The ability of the green beetles to pass on their genes is being selected against by the birds. And this is just a simple example. We'll talk more about a lot of this stuff later, but it helps to look at these simple graphics to understand how natural selection works. Around the same time that Darwin was doing his work, another scholar, Alfred Russel Wallace, was discovering something very similar. So they ended up, I think, presenting their papers around the same time. Oftentimes, Wallace gets forgotten about, but they both discovered a mechanism by which evolution occurs. Again, biological evolution is defined as a change in gene frequencies in a population over time. Don't forget that. The thing is, Charles Darwin didn't know about genes or DNA. So when I was talking about traits earlier, I could have been talking about genes, but that's not what Darwin said. He talked about heritable traits. We later discovered in science that genes are the heritable traits. But again, Charles Darwin had no notion of genes or DNA. But in the first half of the 20th century, Mendelian genetics were rediscovered. So Mendel's work was rediscovered. And in the 1920s and 30s, biologists realized that both changes in genes, which are mutations, along with natural selection, contributed to biological evolution. So a new comprehensive theory was formed that kind of bundles Darwin's discovery of natural selection with the new knowledge about genetics and mutations into the new theory, the new modern evolutionary theory called the modern synthesis. So we will discover or talk more about the modern synthesis in later modules. But for now, this modern synthesis is a theory that explains that evolution is gradual, based on environmental adaptation and small genetic changes within geographically separated populations after many generations of natural selection. So this theory is the synthesis of natural selection and genetics. This is often called neo-Darwinism, evolutionary synthesis, or modern evolutionary theory. So now we'll move on so you can learn about some of these discoveries in genetics and further understand processes of biological evolution. Most important for this lesson is for you to understand natural selection. So let's review real quick. Natural selection is defined as the evolutionary process through which factors in the environment exert pressure, favoring some individuals over others to produce the next generation. Natural selection accounts for adaptive change by acting on the genetic frequencies produced by other evolutionary mechanisms, such as mutation, gene flow, and genetic drift. So natural selection is just one way that evolution occurs. Other forces of evolution include mutation, gene flow, and genetic drift. So to conclude and review, a theory is an explanation of natural phenomena based on a reliable body of data. Biological evolution is a change in gene frequencies in a population over time or over generations. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection has been combined with information based on discoveries in genetics to form the modern synthesis, which is the current scientific theory of biological evolution. This brings us to this week's video. You have probably been assigned to watch Charles Darwin and the Tree of Life. It gives you a history of Darwin and his discoveries, beginning with examples of what scholars thought, and kind of like what I told you about in this lesson. And the video culminates with Darwin's theory of natural selection.